very fortunate from my very young age that I knew all I wanted to do was fly airplanes. And I'm not sure where that desire came from, but as far as I remember back, I was just fascinated with airplanes, and it was the only thing I ever wanted to do. So I think I had the advantage of having that direction for a very long period of time, which kind of guided me through my courses at high school, my courses at college, what I wanted to do in the military and afterwards. And so I think that kind of direction really helps you achieve your goal a little bit quicker, because you're not diverted in changing your majors or your ideas. Because my parents knew that I just wanted to fly so bad, because I'd spent all my spare time out at the airport just meeting people and working on airplanes and everything else. So they actually gave me a $100 gift certificate at a flight school to get my flight started right out of high school. And then I went into college and continued to fly. I would work part-time and use that money for flight lessons while I was in college. So by the time I got out of college, I already had my private pilot's license. And that was right in the height of Vietnam. And I knew that I didn't have the financial resources to continue with that amount of training. So about the best way to get it was to go into the military. And so I went into the military and was very fortunate enough to have the physical ability, eyesight and everything else to get into the flight school. Qualified for flight school and went over to Vietnam, served a term over there. Got some great experience and wonderful leadership training. I was flying out of Tahoe, Nevada, down to San Francisco, and a man asked if he could sit in the right seat in the jump seat on the airplane. And I was kind of reluctant to do that because I didn't want to be asked questions all the way down to there, but I removed all the flight data out of there, and he sat there. On the way down there, I found out that he was a captain for Delta Airlines, and his best friend was the chief pilot for Western Airlines. And so he said that he would introduce me to the right people at the right time and help me get hired. If it hadn't been for that contact, if it hadn't been for that one person, I don't know if I would have been as successful. But sometimes you just happen to meet the right people at the right time that can make your career go in the direction that you want it to go in. I flew for the airlines for just under 30 years. I retired at 58. The airlines are going through some difficult financial times. And so I retired at 58, but I flew for the airlines for about 30 years. But I flew professionally before that as an instructor or air taxi pilot for about 8 years before that after the military. So not quite a 40-year career where I was actually making a living and flying. In the mid-1960s, the Boeing 727 was a very new airplane. And I was fascinated by that airplane because at a very younger age, I drew out what I thought that airplane should look like. And I always was drawing airplanes, and I thought, why in the world wouldn't you take the engines off the wing and leave the wing just to do what it's supposed to do, without any of these encumbrances of engines hanging off it? Just let it be a wing and put those engines back on the back of the airplane. And so I drew this airplane out, and it was kind of fun to see the engines back on the back and thinking how the thrust level would be and everything else. And this was when I was a very young boy. And then to see that airplane developed and come into production and fly, wow, somebody else had that idea that this might work too. I was fascinated by the airplane. This is some of the places we can get into the similarities between working for a city as a fireman and actually working for an airline as a pilot. Because oftentimes the career we choose, the stability of that career is dependent on things that are outside our control. And in the airlines, it was dependent a great deal on the economy and whether the economy was strong or not. And it also, that depended on a great deal of fuel costs. And fuel costs were out of our control. So if the fuel prices went way up, our profits went way down, and we got into an economic slump. You work out the same thing in a city where sometimes the legislature, which is out of your control, will change things that will affect the finances of the city, tax redistribution, those type of things. Or you just go through an economic slump like we did in 2008 or something, where we don't receive nearly the revenue, and so you go through that slump. During those times, benefits and pay have to be looked at seriously. See if they have to be cut back, if people have to be laid off. We laid off quite a few people in the early 1980s in the airlines because of that, and I was one of them. And so you have cutbacks in the city as well, or you don't have as many benefits offered, or you don't have pay for the next few years until you can financially recover. I noticed another similarity between pilots and firemen is that they are so truly professional in their career. It almost doesn't make any difference what's happening on the outside with the industry because it doesn't affect their competency. They have so much pride in what they do and how well they do it, whether they're going through economic troubles with the city or with the airlines. Morale might be affected somewhat because of the downturn of the economy, but professionalism and competency stays the same. And I know I've seen that in firemen, and I know I've seen it in pilots as well. We just have too much pride and demands on ourselves to make sure that what we do ensures safety for others and maintains a certain level of competency and training. Once again, there's a similarity between our two professions. And the similarity is that you know that when you go to work, there is a possibility that you could be put at some point in that day in a dangerous situation. That's what your job is all about. Or in a position where you could be saving lives or affecting people's lives. But you can't let that just control all your thought, or you'd be too afraid to go to work every day. And so the same thing with being a pilot. Whenever you enter that cockpit, you recognize the responsibility that you have and somewhat of the danger that you have, but you don't concentrate on that danger. And just like a fireman, it's kind of in the back of your mind, but you know that you have confidence in the training that you have, that it overrides any level of fear that you would have. And so there is that same level of responsibility for lives, for a pilot, that you have as a fireman. But the other thing that's kind of similar between us is I would normally work for about 3-day trips when I was flying domestically. Your international trips are much longer. They would be maybe 6 or 7 days away. And then you would get a commensurate amount of time at home. So if I was gone for 3 days, I was normally home for 3 days. If I was gone for 7 days, then I was home for 7 days. And firemen do the same thing, where they're gone from home literally 24 hours a day for maybe more than 1 or 2 days. And then they have to come back into that family and try and assimilate themselves back into a family that has been functioning for a few days without them. You have to assume your appropriate role. And you have to appreciate the fact that somebody else has had that role for a few days. And so if my wife has been kind of the boss of the family, and she's got things organized in a certain way, then I can't intrude on that organization by walking in and say, okay, everything's changed now, I'm back, so we're going to do it my way. And so I think you come to a real agreement on how things are going to be transferred as far as authority, or dad's back and dad does it a different way than mom does it and all that. So I think that just comes with working together within your family or within your marriage, but there's stress to that. I was really surprised, very surprised, when I retired, and I asked my kids at a retirement dinner, why didn't any of you follow me into aviation? And they all said the same thing. They said, because you were always gone, Dad. And it hit me that I thought I was never gone. I thought I was just gone and seemed like I was always home. And they said, no, you were gone a lot, Dad. And I never realized that how much it affected my family because I was busy and occupied in doing the things that I did. But so I think we have to appreciate that as firemen or in a profession that takes you away. There is a little bit of effect there, and you have to work on those relationships. In the early 1980s, when I was living out in the Bay Area, there was an Asian carrier that was coming out of one of the Asian countries. I'm not sure if it was Japan or China. But they were flying over to San Francisco in an airplane that was called a 747 SP. And they were flying it over across the Pacific one evening. And the pilot decided up at a very high service ceiling altitude, where the airplane, that's about as high as the airplane can go, the airplane was getting a little bit unstable. And so he tried a procedure in order to increase the chord length of the wing by deploying some of the flaps a little bit. And the flaps, obviously, on an airplane come out before they start to go down. So he wanted to increase the chord length of the wing to give it more stability at high altitude so that they wouldn't have this little waffling effect. Unfortunately, during the procedure, things did not go right, and it was not a procedure that was common or should have been done. And things went wrong, and the airplane got out of control and was headed down for the Pacific, and it literally turned upside down and was going at an incredibly high speed towards the Pacific Ocean. At one time, when it rotated through a certain attitude, the pilot knew at this attitude I can throw out the landing gear, and if I throw out the landing gear, that'll create enough parasite drag that will slow the airplane down, and possibly I can get control of this thing before we hit the ocean. Well, there's landing gear speeds and landing gear door speeds, maximum speeds on an airplane. Well, of course, you don't care about that at that time. So he deployed the landing gear, and it far exceeded the landing gear door speeds, and it ripped all the landing gear doors off the airplane. They went back and did some pretty severe damage to the fuselage and also hit the horizontal stabilizer and severely damaged this horizontal stabilizer. The fuselage was so overstressed that there were ripple marks all the way along the fuselage where it had been overstressed. So the airplane, they finally did get control of the airplane because of that maneuver of putting out all the parasite drag. And they finally were able to level it off right before they hit the ocean, and they limped back into San Francisco and safely landed the airplane. Well, when they interviewed the captain of that airline, one of the interviewers asked him, "Weren't you scared?" His response to that was misinterpreted by the vast majority of the people that were watching that interview. His response was, "I am the captain. I am not allowed to be scared." Now, most people took that as a very egotistical statement, and it wasn't egotistical at all. It was a statement of the fact that he had been trained to the point where he could not allow himself to lose the control of that airplane or to be fighting to regain control of that airplane, regardless of anything, all the way to impact, if that was the case. And he couldn't give himself up to being overwhelmed or scared, or else they were totally lost and there was no hope for him at all. Here's the analogy that I'd like to make with this. Every single pilot, whenever they start training with instrument training, every pilot will get vertigo. No matter how macho you are, when you don't have any visual control, any visual reference to the outside, when you don't have any horizon to give you reference, when your feet are off the ground and you lose your balance that way because you're up in an airplane on a 3-axis pendulum, your inner ear, if you close your eyes, will tell you that you're doing things that you're not actually doing. Because within your inner ear are some very fine hair follicles that are controlled by some fluid in there. And when you move your head, that fluid moves past those hair follicles and tells you if you're turning left or if you're turning right or if you're falling backwards or forwards. But when you're off the ground and you don't have your feet on the ground that can also tell you that by balance, and you don't have visual clues to tell you that the horizon is right here or the horizon is slightly going this way, when you don't have any of that, you trust your inner ear, and that's the only input into your brain of the attitude that your body is at. And most likely in an airplane, it's always wrong. And so you have to train yourself under a hood or under instrument conditions to totally ignore what your mind, what your body is, and your ear is telling your mind. And you've been doing this your whole life, and you've been trusting those senses your whole life. But you have to train yourself to totally disregard and ignore those senses and only trust your visual senses to the instruments. And while you're trying to do that, you always get this air sickness. Until you master that, you'll get air sickness. And once you master it, then that sensation goes completely away, or you ignore it to a point where it doesn't have any input to you, and you are 100% relying on visual contact with those instruments. So you get away from the sensation of vertigo. When I was going through captain's training, we were doing multiple emergencies. And those happen, we'll be flying along and all of a sudden you realize you have an APU fire. And the APU is located in the landing gear area, so you have a fire in that landing gear area. Well, if you don't do something about that, that fire is going to turn into another emergency because it'll burn through electrical lines or hydraulic lines, or it'll damage the landing gear tires. So you can have one emergency on top of another emergency. We had so many multiple emergencies in this one training session that I was in as a captain that I finally just threw up my hands and said, stop the simulator. Just freeze the simulator. This is not realistic, and these multiple emergencies would never happen. And the person that was instructing me said, that's exactly where we wanted you to go, Captain, because just like you were trained to ignore vertigo, we're going to train you now to ignore the sensation of being overcome or overwhelmed, because you cannot allow yourself to feel overwhelmed, or else 302 people are going to die in the back, 9 crew members and yourself. So you've got to be the one person that will not allow yourself to become scared, overwhelmed, or overcome by the situation. You've got to train yourself to delegate better, to determine what is the things that you have to do, how can you download some of these things to someone else, and to stay in control. And so that's what we did with that training. We went through that time and time again. And it became a sense where you wouldn't allow yourself to be scared. That happens the same with firemen. You can do this with firemen in that you can train yourself, you literally train your mind that you will not allow yourself to become overwhelmed. You can't afford to let yourself be overwhelmed or overcome by the situation, because your training kicks in and you know, I've got a job to do here. And regardless of the dire circumstances that are around me, even if it's a catastrophic ending, I've got to keep that control all the way to the end, or else I'm going to die and the people I'm going to try and save are going to die. Cockpit resource management was introduced probably in the early 80s, I would say, maybe the late 70s. Cockpit resource management was the result of, we were finding that there were many people that were now working in a 3-member cockpit crew. They were used to being a single-seat jet pilot, being in control of everything, and being the top dog on everything. And now they were hired with an airlines, and they had to sit side saddle on a flight engineer panel and watch 2 other people fly an airplane. And that personality change, that change of them being in command and stuff, often didn't work well with the personalities up front. And so we found we had World War II pilots, we had Vietnam pilots, we had civilian pilots, we had female pilots that were being introduced to it. There was just a real interesting dynamic going on in the cockpit. But the most important thing was to make sure, regardless of that dynamic, that these 3 people could come together and work together as a team. And so we had to teach those people that the most important thing for you to do, and you have very little time to do this, is to get together and decide how we're going to run this operation, how we're going to go through procedures, how we're going to coordinate our actions with the flight attendant crew, and how we're going to get from point A to point B in a way that's safe for everyone. You don't work with the same person all the time, but you have to be able to work with just about anybody in a team situation. And we had to do that because we often flew with different crew members on almost every flight. And at least, for sure, every month we would be with a totally different crew member. And I would imagine this is the same with the fire department. The person in charge sets the tone for the entire crew. If I was flying with a captain that was very gregarious, very happy, a lot of fun to be with, the whole crew took on that personality. But if I was flying with someone that was very subdued and very serious and everything, the whole crew took on that very subdued. And so I saw that one person set the tone or the personality for the entire crew. And that was very important for me to learn from those really good captains, and also to learn from those that I didn't think had those people skills. And so I'm sure it's the same thing here. You have to know who's in control, but you also have to be able to have a personality where you can work with people and not feel that you're the only person that has all the answers and that you're always the brightest and the smartest. Because in a cockpit crew, and it might be when you change positions in the fire crew, you're not the smartest person in the room at that time. Because if I just qualified on a brand new airplane, on a brand new route structure, I might be the captain and the man with all the responsibility, but this co-pilot has been flying this airplane for 7 years, and he's gone to this St. Petersburg, Russia, on 50 different approaches. And so I might be the person in charge and the person with responsibility, but I'm not as smart as he is on this airplane. So you have to respect that a great deal, almost acknowledge that. I understand my level of responsibility here, but I also appreciate your level of experience here, and we can work together here real well. So when you don't do that, you get people who are highly experienced not willing to transfer that experience over to someone that they feel is so arrogant they wouldn't accept it to begin with. We advocate, navigate, then communicate. That's the first 3 parameters that you have to do. By advocate, you mean the most important thing that we have to do is regain control of this airplane if it's in an unusual attitude or something. So we need to make sure that the sunny side is up and make sure that everything's flyable. Then we need to make sure the next priority is we need to make sure that we're navigating correctly. Now we've got control of the airplane. We need to make sure that we're navigating in the right place so that we're not going through other people's altitudes or other people's flight paths. So, and then the next thing we have to do is communicate. And communication has a few different levels. Who do you communicate with first? Is it more important to tell the flight attendants what just happened? Or is it more important to tell the FAA and the control tower what just happened? Or is it more important to tell you the guy right next in the next seat to you, I've got control of this, I've got control of that. So you have to determine the level of communication that you need. My most important form of communication is I have to get the cockpit crew. Everybody's on the right checklist, everybody recognizes the same problem, everybody's going through all the procedures and protocols the same way. Now let's get a hold of the FAA and tell them what's happened, what our situation is, and advise them of what we're going to do. Then after all that's settled down, then we better tell the flight attendants and the passengers what they've just experienced as well. So we advocate, navigate, and communicate. And if we do those 3 basic things, then we're going to get through checklists, we're going to communicate, we're going to have the airplane under control. You know, you have priorities that you have to do. And those priorities, if so well trained, will just click in and be absolutely natural that you don't even think about it. It's just done a matter of course. And you don't have to think, well, this is the next step I'm going to do. It's already done before you actually realize you're doing it. And so those are the things that we are trained to, and the things that you go through in your training that just kick in as being a natural response before you physically have to think about it. In a cockpit crew situation, when you're working with 2 or 3 other pilots in there, you need to make sure that you have a respect for all of their different skill levels and their level of responsibility. I can't be managing fuel on a flight engineers panel at the same time flying the airplane, but I know for sure that that man is managing the fuel, and he's making sure that we have positive pressure in all the hydraulic lines. He's making sure all the generators are on, and I don't have to even think about that because he's doing all that. I know this man over here is communicating with everybody he needs to, and he's doing it at a level that he knows there are certain priorities to do, and I know that they're expecting me to do my job. So if we got down on the ground after an incident like that, and they all knew that I took that whole thing upon myself, it wouldn't be something I'd brag about. It'd be something I'd be pretty ashamed of. Checklists are absolutely vital. In our industry, we're only allowed to be checked out on 1 airplane at a time. You can't go from an L-1011 to a 727 and the next leg you're flying a 737. The airplanes are so different and the systems are so different and the procedures and everything, emergency procedures are so different that you can only be checked out on 1 airplane at a time. And those checklists are what keep us in such an order. They are so well thought out that they have already prioritized those things that are most important and what will lead to the next thing in that priority list. And so the checklists are something that we also go through so often that oftentimes you don't even have to physically read the checklist because you've mentally gone from one position to another position to another position. But the checklist is always there to back you up. And it's amazing to me that checklists can be changed. You would think that we've been flying this airplane for 10 or 15 years. Why would you ever need the checklist changed? Well, because we found out that something happened on another airplane of that similar type. And if we don't change the checklist, then that could happen to us. So let's change the checklist to include this in our new checklist to make sure that we never get in that situation again. So checklists are absolutely vital to us. We use them all the time in our training and in our normal procedures and everything else. But everybody knows their position in the checklist. There are responses that the captain is supposed to respond to, that the first officer is supposed to respond to, and the flight engineer, second officer, is supposed to respond to. And so when we go through the checklist, we're looking for different people to respond to different things. In-flight emergencies are the same thing. We have checklists, a large book of checklists, that as soon as you have, for instance, a hydraulic failure, you go right to that place and flip over, and there's normally first response stuff that you have to do right away and get the situation under control. And then there's follow-up checklists that after that to restore certain systems that you might have had to deactivate or turn off, and to repower generators and so like that. So there's a primary checklist that is almost memorized checklist. In fact, it is a memorized checklist. Very short, very primary things that you have to do. And then after that, well thought out things to restore the system back to it. We've already talked about navigate, and communicate, and prioritizing the most important matters. What is primary, what is secondary, what is after that. And I would imagine that in the fire department, you have the same thing, because you'll have emergencies come up that were not anticipated, even emergencies within the emergency that were not anticipated. And so at that time, you still have to figure out, okay, now do I go and save this person right over here, or do I continue to put fire out so I can get to that person, or do I have to make sure that the crew is behind me to back me up and that I have the proper backup response? All those things play into your mind. And that's what we were talking about when you're trained to think through a highly intense moment where you're not consumed about how difficult it is or how challenging it is. You're consumed about what is the right thing to do and where are my priorities at. And if I don't do this first, I'm never going to get to that person. But if I do this first, then I have the chance of getting not only to that person, but to several other people as well. And so that list of priorities is absolutely essential to make sure that you have that. And you don't even have to have it memorized, because the situation is going to be so dynamic, so different every time, that you don't have to have a list of checklist items that you do. You just have to have confidence in yourself that you can adapt to that ever-changing environment to a point where you can instantly prioritize and change the checklist however you need to in order to best handle the situation. I would imagine when the number one top priority in fighting a fire is fighting the fire, putting water on the fire. Before you can do anything else, before you can think about saving people or the safest way to do this or that, you have to fight the fire. And you have to have confidence that you know that even if you're diverted to doing something else, somebody else is putting water on the fire. And the same thing with flying an airplane. The most important thing is to get control of that airplane, and not to communicate to somebody, not to make sure that you're on course. Get control of the situation. That's the number one priority. And that co-pilot is going to be depending on that captain taking control of that airplane and doing everything he can to regain control while he is doing secondary important things. And the flight engineer is doing a lower level of responsibility. But everybody knows that somebody is either flying the airplane or putting water on the fire. And that's what we need. I had the opportunity while I was flying for 30 years from the airlines to have about 1/3 of that career, about 10 years, as being a line check airman. That gave me the opportunity not to be in a simulator, but be in the airplane itself and checking new people out on the airplane or on specific routes we had. We had special qualification airports that were difficult airports, and you didn't want to fly in there if you've never been in there with an experienced pilot. And so I had the opportunity to fly with those pilots and show them how we would go into a special qualification airport, or to check them out on an airplane and qualify them, sign them off to operate the airplane in that position. So for 10 years, I was not only in a flying position, which I really loved, but I had the opportunity to also be in a teaching situation in the cockpit as well. And that combined two things that I loved. One was flying, and the other was sharing my enthusiasm for the job with somebody else. And I really enjoyed that. And I found out that when I was teaching, if I would remove the fear that was just inherent by being brand new and under the pressure of being under an exam, if I removed that fear as much as I could, the person would learn so much faster. And to try and teach under fear that if you don't get this, you're going to be fired, or you're going to have to go back to school and be retrained or something, is probably the worst scenario that you can put a person in to learn. But if you'll let them know, hey, we were all in that position at one time. I was brand new on this airplane too. Now it's kind of second nature to me. So it'll become second nature to you when you just relax and learn at a pace that is comfortable to you. Now we know the demands that are placed on us to learn quickly and to adapt quickly and everything else. But you can do that in an environment that encourages people instead of makes them feared. And so I think that's a much better situation to be in. I always felt that if a person failed in their check ride or they failed in learning their different procedures, it was as much my fault as it was theirs. And I always assumed when they came into the cockpit, you're here for a good reason. You've already qualified yourself. You've already proven yourself to other people. Now all I have to do is take those same skills that you've already proven that you've had in other airplanes and other situations, and we'll adapt them to this new airplane, and maybe flying overseas instead of flying domestically. And so we're going to take all those wonderful skills that you have and just add to them and improve them. And as soon as they feel that that's the environment, then they just open up to learning. When I was trying to get hired on with the airlines, that was a difficult process to go through because there were so many people trying to qualify for the job. Very much like firemen. You have a lot of people applying for one or two positions, and you have to narrow those down to just the selected few. And so those people are under quite a bit of stress to try and qualify for something that they want so badly. And they've been trained to a certain level at that point to get to that interview process. And one of my career-defining moments was when I was getting hired on with the airlines, was I had gone through all the simulators time, I had gone through all the psychological tests, I'd gone through all the interviews with the chief pilots, and it came down to this one interview that I had with a medical doctor after an all-day physical exam. It was kind of a psychological test to me to see if I was going to be able to work together well within a crew. And so I was very nervous that this one man held my career in his hands. And if I passed this test, I was going to be hired with the airlines and my dreams were going to come true. And if I didn't, then I was pretty old to try and start this whole thing all over again. We entered the interview process, and it was a one-on-one, and he was trying to see if he could kind of rattle me with a personality that might not be as congenial as you would like. So he wasn't very friendly or very kind, and he was very, very direct about his questions. And his first question to me was, do you drink alcohol? And I said, no, I don't. And he said, well, do you smoke cigarettes? And I said, no, I don't. Now, the reason that I knew that he was asking those type of questions was because he wanted to make sure that over a 30-year career, that health was important enough to me to qualify to meet those flight standards every single year from a flight surgeon. And so he was asking those, and then he asked me, do you use drugs? And I said, well, no, I don't. He says, have you ever used drugs? And I said, not illegal drugs, I never have. And he said to me, are you lying to me? Are you just trying to make yourself look good? And I looked back at him and said, no, I'm not. Those are the values that I was raised by, and I had never a reason to question them. And he took his pen on this long list of following questions and drew a line down through all the rest of the questions and signed the papers and said, will never have to worry about you with those kind of values being a pilot for Western Airlines," and handed me the sheet. So sometimes when we do those things in our lives that we know are right, and they don't disqualify us from what we want to do. Can you imagine a policeman going through all the academy and then in his final interview find out that he had 2 DUIs a few years before that would disqualify him for that? And so it's very fortunate to be able to live in a certain way that you know is not going to disqualify you from a dream that you're working for all your life. And so if you do those things with honesty and responsibility, one of those questions on the exam was, have you ever been bankrupt? What does that make me a good pilot for? It shows that you have financial responsibility as much as anything else. And they wanted to see that you had responsibility in all aspects of your life instead of just being a red-hot pilot. And so they wanted to interview all those things and ask those type of questions. So that was a defining moment to me when I realized that just living a decent, quality life can pay back when you're put into a situation where people are really evaluating what type of character they're trying to hire here. Now, another kind of defining moment for me was when I was checked out as a captain, my very first captain checkout, because that's a big deal. You've been flying side saddle for 5 years, you've been in the right seat, flying for 6 or 8 years or more, just dying to get that 4th stripe and become a captain and everything. And you know that you got one shot at it. And if you don't pass captain school, you probably won't have a job after that, because the airlines want everyone to be able to move up and qualify as a captain. And if you don't have that level of skills, then you probably don't have the level of skills that you should be anywhere else in the cockpit, because you're not there until you have the experience that you should be there. And so my first checkout as captain, the pressure was on to know that, once again, my career is on the line here. And I have to learn and I have to show my skill level at a level that is competent enough for them to have trust in me, that when that airplane pushes back from the gate, when that fire truck pulls out of the fire station, you own it. You're in control. You're responsible for everything on and around that airplane or that engine, and it's yours. And that's a high level of responsibility to take on. So they have to have a lot of confidence that if they're going to give something that's that expensive and that complex to somebody, they have trust that they're going to be able to handle that in any situation that's given to them. And so going through that checkout and being able to pass that checkout, and then gaining the confidence that you can do that job in a very reasonable way that other people appreciate that you have the skill level that warrants it, was a real exciting time for me. It was the culmination of my career, was to become that, and then to be able to enjoy that being a captain for a good number of years after that was the icing on the cake for me in my career. So when we went out to the airport in November of 1965, Salt Lake City Airport, I was always looking for a 727 because it was the most advanced commercial jet at that time. And I saw one coming in. And I thought, I'm going to be able to see the whole approach, the downwind, the base leg, the turn to final, the setting up and watching this whole thing. And then I could see that this was not a standard approach, that things were getting too low, and that I don't see how he's going to be able to pull this up. Well, the captain was not flying the airplane, and I followed this story so well where even today, some 40 years or more later, I still know that captain's name in my mind like it was yesterday. But he was not flying the airplane, and he saw that the co-pilot was getting too low, so he said, in the middle of an approach, he assumed control of that airplane again. And then he let it deteriorate to a point where he had to bring on full power on the airplane. Well, with a jet engine, you have a certain spool-up time. It's not instant response that you would get with a propeller digging in. That engine has to spool up and suck in more air, and it takes a second or two for it to do that. And when all three engines are on the tail, and you add all this power, the airplane pitches up. So you've added to your problem. You've added all this power, you're below the glide slope, your nose is now up and you're sinking, and it was just disastrous. It was just a combination of events. This captain was brand new on that airplane. He had only been used to the very quick response in a DC-6 or a DC-7 with four great big propeller-driven engines out there. And he just didn't know how the response of a jet would be compared to a prop airplane. And so he landed about 200 feet short of the runway and knocked off the main landing gear on the airplane. And then the airplane continued to slide right down the middle of the runway, and the front nose gear came off, and the fuel cells on the airplane burst into flames. And then the flames got inside the fuselage and started at the front and worked their way all the way to the back. And so we just saw the whole top of the fuselage become engulfed in flame and start to cave in on people. All the fire trucks from the fire station out there came out to the airplane. They were putting foam all over it they could, while at the same time people were trying to get out of the airplane itself. And we just happened to be standing, or I just happened to be standing right next to the fence where the airplane was directly at a 90-degree angle from me. So it was right in front of me. So we got to watch the entire episode of where the fire crew came out and fought that fire and tried to save lives and to get that whole situation under control. And I had a renewed respect for what it takes to really keep an airplane like that under control, and new respect for training and procedures and a change of command inside of a cockpit at a critical time. So because I studied that incident so much, because I had seen it and because it had made such an impression on me, the things I learned from that I took with me throughout my entire career. And I thought, please never let me get into a situation where I would be responsible for something like that to happen. And that was kind of a guiding influence behind me, that I always wanted to feel I was doing my absolute utmost I could to be the most competent pilot I could be. I think the reason that we see an awful lot of people have a misconception of both careers is because of what they've witnessed on television shows or in movies that kind of glamorize the position even beyond what it actually in reality is. And so they think that that position is going to be that way all the way through, and it's not. It's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of responsibility. It's a lot of training. And it's not all just glamour and glitz and great pay and wonderful benefits. But there are similarities between the fireman and the pilot that relate so much to being away from home. And that's normally should be our number one priority, is our relationship with our family and our relationship with others around us that we love and depend on us so much. The relationships we had in the cockpit were very important because we had to work together as a crew. But that's not the same level of relationship as it is with the family. I have no idea. I knew I loved this city. I knew that this city was the only place I wanted to raise my family, the only place I wanted to live, even though they would have paid me to live somewhere else. But I never knew why it was so great until I was in a position to see how it works, in a position to see the firemen, the policemen, the department heads, the dedication of senior staff. I mean, these are the people that make this city great, but I didn't know them personally. I didn't know what they do and how they did it and everything else. And now I'm in a position to see the whole beehive. You know, I go, golly, no wonder this city is so great. You know, now I really understand it.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
we're very fortunate to be here, I'll tell you.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
When I was furloughed from the airlines for a little bit. Remember I told you that they went through an economic downturn and they laid a few of us off for a while. And I thought, how am I going to support my family? Well, I found a job crawling under, I have pretty good claustrophobia. But I found a job crawling under subfloors, installing insulation in people's subfloors for $10 an hour. And so day after day, I would take all this insulation underneath the subfloor and scoot it along and crawl in the subfloor and stuff insulation up in the subfloors. And I finally got to a position where they would let me sell the insulation to the people at the door. It was under an energy conservation program, and they would call us and say, we need insulation. So I'd go out there and sell it to them. Went up to this, I was living in the Bay Area, pulled up to this home, unbelievable home, with a back view of the entire Bay Area. And man, this guy is doing pretty well. So I went up to the home, and there was a mezuzah on the door. Well, I knew what that was. I knew the scripture that was rolled up inside that, and I almost wanted to touch it because I had such reverent respect for the Jewish religion. But I thought, I better not rub my hand across that thing like they do. But I knew the history behind it and everything. And then I heard this incredible piano music inside the home. But it wasn't a recording, because it would stop and then start over again and go for a little bit and stop, and then it would go down. I thought, this is the most beautiful piano music. And I just sat there listening to it, and I thought, you know what, some neighbor is going to call and say, you got this loiterer outside your door that's just got his ear up to your door or something. So I better knock on the door. So I rang the doorbell, and this small little man came and answered the door, and he was quite a bit older than me and everything. And he let me in, and I could tell by the menorah and everything in his home and everything that he was obviously outwardly very Jewish and everything. And I just loved that religion. So we talked a great deal about not only insulation, but just about each other and our lives and all that kind of stuff, and our different religions and his family. And I asked him, where is that beautiful piano music coming from? And he said, that's my son in the basement. He's getting his doctorate degree from Juilliard School of Music in piano composition. And he's writing his final composition. Oh my goodness, this is pretty cool. So we talked, and he was going to sign the contract. And so I had the contract all filled out so we could put insulation in his house. I turned the contract around and handed it to him. And he put his hand out, and when he put his arm out, his sleeve went up like this, and I noticed the tattoo on his arm. And I just froze. And I looked at him, and I was so afraid to say anything, but I knew that he felt kindly towards me. And so I said, please, I'm so sorry if I'm so out of bounds here, but I know the meaning of that tattoo. Would you mind telling me about that? And he said, and then he went in. He was the only surviving member of his entire family, and he was there in Dachau when it was liberated, and all the rest of the family had gone to the gas chamber. And after he told me that whole story, I looked at him and said, did you ever think when you were a 12-year-old boy in Dachau that you would be living in a free country, that you would someday have a home like this, that you would have a son getting a doctorate degree in music composition? Did you ever think that? And he said something to me, Joe, that I'll never forget. It's been well over 40 years ago. He said, as long as there is hope in the human heart, anything is possible.